Right, as I was noting, the YouTube live sometimes has minimal viewers, but I still appreciate all those who tune in. Yes, I still appreciate all those who tune in. It is much appreciated. So, what we're talking about today? Who's in the chat? Whoa! Someone is sending quite a few roses. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for the roses. I'm not sure what I'd do with them, but they're appreciated nonetheless. King Kong, you related to a Josiah Springer? Yes, I am. That is my eldest brother. Love your content, Crystal Carlton. Thank you, sir. No, it's not God yet, Shiny Douglas. It was just me. What's up, Just Sarah, Woj, Richard Jagannath? Welcome to Mindful, your host, Nathan Springer. Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that intro, Mr. Righteous Rebel. Okay, so what we're talking about today, what we're starting off with today is good news for the residents in Freeport. If you were in the live yesterday, or if you followed some of the articles we did, some of the news we did yesterday, again, to those in the chat, if you didn't know, the majority of the news topics we discuss on the live are recorded, and that's kind of why I do the YouTube live also, because the YouTube live stays there. You could go back and look over nearly the entirety of the live, and today I got around to actually chopping up some of those videos on YouTube, some of the lives. So if you go over to my YouTube channel, please do subscribe, Nathan Springer on YouTube. And if you go there, a lot of these stories are there. And now I am attempting to edit them. So you won't have to go through the entire hour-long live to get whatever story you're interested in. You just be able to go there and select out a specific story that you're interested in. And you could take that in anytime you'd like. Also, what I'm doing with the edits is you have the actual article playing in the background, so you could actually read along, and then in the description there's a link to the article. Something is on my mustache. Not anymore. Thank you, kind sir. Or kind ma'am. Very appreciated. Oh, cuz, what's up? Alright, so the Freeport residents, they were complaining about the possibility of a cold body storage being introduced into their area. An announcement was made by our chief medical officer earlier on. He was saying that the bodies are overcrowding some of the morgues, some of the mortuaries. So what they need now is some additional storage for some of these bodies. And their idea was that they wanted a more central location for this storage. So they announced that they're going to take this storage into Freeport. And the Freeport residents, apparently, they didn't hear that information before. And when it came across that this is their plan, the residents were not very happy. They were like, nope, we do not want that here. And some people can say that they're complaining over nothing, and what's the real fuss about? It's not like it's going to affect them negatively. And okay, you could say that if you want, but I could understand completely why residents in a particular area would not be interested in having a building filled with dead corpses from a pandemic in their neighborhood. I fully understand that. Anyway, from The Guardian, Freeport scrapped. Association looks for new area to store bodies of COVID dead. The mass body storage facility for COVID-19 fatalities in Bokaro, Freeport, has been scrapped, and the Funeral Professionals Association is now looking for another suitable site to establish the facility. The announcement came from the association's president, Mr. Keith Belgrove, yesterday. He said the association has heard the concerns of the community and will immediately stop the project. At this association, this is Mr. Belgrove speaking, at this association of funeral professionals, it was never our intent to upset the residents in any way. Wherever funeral service operates, we are partners with the community within which we operate, he said. And I like this approach from Mr. Belgrove. I appreciate this completely. He saw a problem was obviously being had there, and these residents didn't want it there, and him making the wise decision that it really doesn't make sense to attempt to force this point. It really doesn't. Mr. Belgrove went on. Belgrove said the association has already identified 2 possible sites for relocating the facility, but more will be revealed as the process makes headway. We will very shortly announce a new location for the facility in which we will be able to avoid the concerns of the residents and the phobia. So now this would be very interesting now, because the fact that it has already been moved and cancelled from being in one area, wherever they put it next is going to be very curious. It obviously cannot be in any residential area, because especially with the fact that this community has already said they don't want it and they have already gotten them to move it. Can you imagine attempting to go into another community and, well, okay, we'd put it here? I don't think that would work. They have to go find somewhere that is pretty secluded, pretty far away. He said funeral homes will now hold bodies of COVID victims until the new facility is established to relieve the burden on the public system. Belgrove said it was customary for regional health authorities to reach out to funeral homes to temporarily store bodies during times of facility maintenance or increased occupancy, which is why the association believes it was the opportune group to assist with the current overflow of bodies. Okay. Some things are curious in this, and it's just questions to me. I don't know necessarily how it functions, but it's an interesting question to me. Our hospitals, when they're overflowing, they go to the funeral homes, and the funeral homes assist in holding some more of the bodies. But do they pay these funeral homes for this? And I wonder what is the price they'll be paying these funeral homes for this service. I'm pretty sure they would be paying them. I doubt these funeral homes would be doing this just out of the kindness of their hearts. And if they're paying them, it would be interesting for me to see a comparison between how much they pay these funeral homes to do this versus what the cost would possibly be if it was done within the public health care system. Mr. Belgrove was explaining part of the reason they chose Freeport in the first place. He was saying that they needed it centrally located, easy access from the highway. They needed a reasonably private space where the population density was extremely low, and they looked around and eventually they selected the facility in Bakari. Now, I understand the part where they're saying it's close to the highway, because Bakari and Freeport, if you know the area, is pretty close to the highway. You have relatively smooth on and off, well, once you don't have the traffic bothering you there. And it is possibly a relatively private space because Bakari doesn't have a high amount of thoroughfare. But the problem I have there is where he said they were looking for a place with extremely low population density. I happen to know the central district. I happen to know the central region. And Bakari doesn't have extremely low population density. I mean, it's not overflowing in high-rise buildings. It's by no means the most populated area in the country, but it's a pretty well-populated residential area. There are multiple communities in that area. Bakari is one basic street, and one basic road, and in multiple side streets of that road have multiple communities. So I don't think they were right when they were saying it had to be a low density population area, because that obviously was not a low density population area. Good night, Mr. Crisp, or Miss Crisp, I'm not sure quite yet. Let's backfill the Carney Swamp and build it there away from everyone. You cannot backfill the Carney Swamp. I think you're joking. I hope you're joking. But backfilling the Carney Swamp is a recipe for flooding in the rest of the country. There was once a time when a particular government was in power, and some contractor took it upon themselves and started filling up to the east, I believe, of the highway in the swamp. They were just filling the swamp. And when you do that, it was no surprise that a couple years later, for probably the first time in my lifetime that I could have remembered, we had flooding covering the majority of that highway going from north to south, the Uriah Butler Highway. We had so much floods on that highway, and I would presume a lot of that flooding had to do with the fact that someone decided it was a grand idea to go filling up the swamp. Listen, nature doesn't do things vitae. Nature has its reasons for doing things. The swamp has a very integral purpose. You don't just go filling up the swamp, not even if you need to use it to hold dead bodies. And why are they cold storaging dead bodies? Because if you do not store the bodies in cold storage, they would rot. And it is kind of morbid to think of storing all of these bodies just like that. But it is also more morbid to think of storing the bodies where they'd be rotting. Can you imagine that scene where first off the scent, and then bear in mind when you're talking bodies, it could seem a bit distant when you use the word bodies, but if you put yourself in this situation as one of these deceased people's family members, and no one would like their deceased family member to be decomposing before they could bury them or cremate them or anything like that. No one wants their family member to be decomposed before they could get rid of the body. And that's why they use cold storage. All right. Let's go on. Belgrove explained yesterday that the association did not go through the requisite channels in the interest of expediency. In the shortness of time, in this urgent situation, to have the facility ready, we really had no intent to go through the normal procedures for setting up something of this nature. It needed to put this facility in place immediately. Now, here's the problem in not going through the right procedures. Okay, I understand what the head of the funeral association is saying there. I understand. In interest of time, they wanted to expedite this entire process, and they didn't want to have to go through getting approvals from town and country. They didn't want to go through having to consult with people and all of that. That would just elongate the process. And okay, I understand that. But now look at what happens nonetheless. You still now have to stall the process because now you cannot hold it in this facility anymore. You have to go looking for some other facility. And now everyone well, not everyone, but a large portion of people would have their eyes and their interest piqued in this story. So personally, for example, me, very likely wherever they move this facility to, I would be interested in seeing where they have done that. And if it isn't in somewhere that is conducive to storing dead bodies, you're going to end up in more problems. So this could be a life lesson to people. In taking shortcuts sometimes, you just end up elongating the process even more. Sometimes the process is that way because that's the best way for it to work. You go through town and country so that you could get the relevant authorities to make sure that where you're putting this thing is feasible. And then you want to have consultations because you have to get the residents to agree. And if the residents don't agree, you have problems. And you see, that's the thing with governance on a whole. Anytime you're doing governance, and you're doing governance where you're making the decisions separate from the people you are meant to be governing, you would always end up in problems because you don't know what these people are thinking. And bear in mind, governance is almost all times a minority group that are in charge of making rules over a vast majority. And if that is the case, as the minority, it becomes very important for you to attempt to always figure out what direction this majority is leading in. What intent do they want to carry out through me governing on their behalf? And that is done through consultation. There seems to be lack of consultation and more immediate action. Yes, that's precisely what it is. Lack of consultation and immediate action. And that same lack of consultation that occurred in the Freeport facility that caused those problems there, that same lack of consultation, I think, is what is at the base of some of the problems, for example, that is going on right now with the unions. The unions have those problems with the government because of the same lack of consultation. People aren't the government isn't consulting the people they're making these decisions on the behalf of. So obviously when you make the decisions and you announce it, then problems are going to arise. I saw the response of one of the unions, NATOC. They had a response coming out, and I found their response to be actually one of the best prepared responses from most of the unions that have already responded. NATOC wants clarity on COVID-19 fatalities, and they say no to mandatory vaccinations. In the live yesterday, someone brought up that topic on COVID fatalities and how in Trinidad, how exactly do we count those fatalities? How are we checking those fatalities? What is the procedure? Is it just the people who died with a positive test of COVID? Or is it the people who actually, the reason they died would have been because of something caused by the COVID-19 virus? Death by COVID-19 versus death with COVID-19. And that's the question that NATOC is asking. General Secretary of the National Trade Union Center of Trinidad and Tobago, Michael Anisette, wants more clarity in what government means by COVID-19 fatalities and is questioning whether the way these fatalities are counted is correct. In an official statement released yesterday, Mr. Anisette called on the Chief Medical Officer, the Minister of Health, and the government to assure the country they have a national and transparent definition for COVID-19 fatalities. Good night, Mr. J. Chris. Good night, only 19 minutes late. Thanks to the invite. Actually discussing that with someone today. I'm glad, Mr. J. Chris, that you reached on time tonight. You didn't miss out the majority and come in only for the closing few likes. I'm glad you're here early. Mr. Anisette's statement comes after the health ministry reported 37 deaths from the disease in one day. Anisette said, after 37 deaths in a single day, reassurance is absolutely needed at this time, and no number of public relations or legal maneuvering can divert the attention of the citizens to the COVID pandemic crisis in Trinidad and Tobago. The vaccinated and unvaccinated are all human beings. He continued, it is expected at this time that many persons going about their daily life will be affected by COVID-19. However, the reality is that many will be subclinical, that is, minimally symptomatic and not severe enough to present definite or readily observable symptoms, and therefore not requiring medical attention, while on the other hand, some will be asymptomatic as confirmed by testing, but never develop symptoms during the period of their infection. Deaths, therefore, in persons who tested positive should not be listed as part of the COVID statistics unless the patient succumbs to a pathology related to COVID-19 like respiratory failure, secondary to COVID lungs injury, pneumonia. Anisette stated further. Okay, this is why I appreciated his statement, because he got in pretty specific. He got in pretty specific in this case, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that from him, the specificity of the questions. It seems when you even take in the language he uses in this, it seems either he knows a bit about the medical field or about biology, or he spoke and consulted with someone in the field before he made this statement. And the statement is accurate. You see, it becomes very important to know exactly what measures we're using to measure the death rate. Because really and truly, the infection rate isn't the most important thing. How many people get infected per day is only relevant as to if people are dying because of it. If something is non-lethal, if it isn't killing anyone, if someone is getting a flu, that all it gives you is a runny nose and within 3 days you're over it. No one cares how many people got that. That is irrelevant to everyone. You get it and you do whatever you want. But when you're talking about people dying, that's where things get really strict and really stringent. And as I've said multiple times, I think a lot of the COVID-19 measures, including the potential safe zone that the government has planned for the public sector, a lot of those measures are really dependent on the death rate. people would be okay with more stringent measures dependent on where the death rate is. So making sure that we have an accurate death rate is very, very, very important to choosing the decisions that we do. And from that perspective, I give NATA full 100 points there. They're asking some of the right questions. The NATA General Secretary says, without a standardized case definition for COVID fatalities, deceased persons without incidental COVID can be misappropriated into daily statistics. Trinidad and Tobago must explicitly define a standardized case definition of COVID fatalities in order to avoid panic in the public domain. And just as you're saying here, Joel Chow too says, I know a couple of people who died from heart attack, yet the hospital labeled them as COVID positive deaths. And I saw some listen, I don't know personally. I don't know anyone like that personally. But speaking from people in the comments, I've seen some people say that. Someone in the comments yesterday was talking about a drowning victim they saw similar things with, and a gunshot victim they saw similar things with. And if that is the case, that is worrying. If the case is that maybe not the majority, who knows how many of the deaths per day are more dying with COVID than dying from COVID, that is really problematic. And here's where the problems with that would very likely balloon out of control. Omicron has already reached Trinidad. I believe we had 7 new cases of Omicron. Some were imported, but it seems like Omicron may very well be in community spread stages. But what we do know about Omicron already is that Omicron seems quite a bit milder than the other strains. But on the other hand, it is also a lot more contagious, a lot more infectious. So very likely what would happen is the Omicron variant would pass through the country much quicker, much faster. More people would get the COVID virus. More people would be testing positive for COVID. So if you have a case where the majority of the country at one point in time tests positive for COVID-19, remember, every day, either way, whether there's COVID-19 or not, people do die. So if you have everyone in the country testing positive for COVID-19 and people are dying, then you would be ballooning those COVID-19 death rate numbers and creating unnecessary panic when the reality might not be that stark. But the case is still that I do not know yet how we check those numbers. Mr. Bob Pascal says, my dad is very sick, and when he went to the hospital, they said he was COVID positive. I buried my auntie and cousin the same day. Condolences, that's tough. That is very tough. Are there repercussions for health authorities manipulating numbers or diplomatic immunity? Kivo TV also asked, what does an unvaxxed death mean? Is it without booster? Is it before the 2 weeks post-vax? Okay, multiple questions there and very interesting points. This is one of my problems, the point Chiny Douglas raised there. Are there repercussions for health authorities manipulating numbers? Now, I don't know necessarily, I don't want to make the accusation of manipulating numbers because I don't know, but I would like there aren't repercussions for nearly anything going on right now. And that's one of the problems I really have with many of the measures in the COVID-19 pandemic. The measures taken by many of the authorities, we don't have any consequences for failure. Now, I'm not saying that I want to see people fired and lose their jobs for authentic mistakes here. But I'm saying that have anyone in the chat noticed any measures taken by any government that after a while they themselves say this was a bad idea and we change it? There seems to be none of that. Nearly all the measures seem to be unfailable. They're infallible measures that the government always says these measures are the best ones done. And I don't think that's even realistically possible. It is obvious some of the measures would not have been ideal. And I think at some point in time, it would make sense if we could reevaluate some of these steps taken. The mask mandates. It has been known, and this is something I've been thinking multiple times if to make a contemplation on this, because I know some people are going to jump in and take it out of context. But the masks, for a long time now, we have known the cloth masks that you see people walking around with, advertising their own little small business and their little entrepreneurship. Those cloth masks don't really do anything. The masks, the majority of what it is COVID-19 theater. It's health theater. It's there to make us feel like we're doing something when the masks don't actually prevent anything. Ask nearly anyone who has been infected by COVID-19. They very likely were wearing a mask when they got it. And the person who they got it from very likely may have been wearing a mask too. The masks give you a false sense of security. They aren't actually protecting that much. And especially when it comes to Omicron, it seems like the masks have no protection value. If you really want protection from the masks, what you need are the N95 masks. Those really serious masks that lock around your face and make sure there's no extra air escaping. But those other cloth masks, they aren't really doing anything. But yet still, government after government would keep telling us that they're following the science and insist on continuing with mask mandates, risking some of your citizens being fined thousands of dollars for something that we have known since 2020 doesn't actually provide any protective effort. So if that is the case, are there any consequences for getting it wrong? And if there are no consequences for getting it wrong, can you blame people for being very skeptical of all measures, seeing that all measures have no consequences if they go south? If the measures go south, and no one says, oops, I'm sorry even. It just rolls on to another measure. It doesn't really make sense. The science has already said that masks don't work. Not all masks. Those cloth masks and those nice blue and white masks, don't worry, I have my box. I have my own box of blue and white masks. And I prefer the black mask. You know, the black masks have a more sleek look. But they still don't do anything. They really don't. What you're doing, listen, I have no problem with mask wearing in general in public, in many cases, because you may be avoiding spitting on people, and spitting on people is just unhygienic in general. So the mask wearing in general has general hygienic benefit. But in COVID-19 specific spread, to enforce a mask mandate and say that this is going to stop something is not actually fully true. All right. The NATOC president, we haven't left the NATOC president yet. He went on to speak about the mandatory vaccinations because he is our union president, so he has something to say on that matter too. The NATOC general secretary, well, he's not a president, they're called general secretaries, my bad. He also addressed the issue of the government's proposed vaccine policy. NATOC will not stand idly by and allow this barbaric act of mandatory vaccinations to be effected on the innocent citizens of our beloved Twin Island, he declared. NATOC believes that if the government or private sector is serious about mandatory vaccination, the question of injury and liability acceptance by healthcare professionals and the government in Trinidad and Tobago must be accepted on behalf of all workers. The question of voluntary informed consent about the ingredients and quality of evidence in the context of long-term safety and the efficacy of the vaccine must also form part of the government's policy for transparency purposes. Now, I think he is knowingly making an impossible request of the government. The government cannot facilitate us by giving us or giving any of their workers proof of long-term safety on these vaccines because the reality is we don't yet know that. We do not yet know that. So, we do not yet know the long-term safety because we haven't yet seen it last that long. That I'm not speaking about the general safety, I'm not getting into that, but it's just plain a time constraint issue. And I've said it before, it's very understandable why it was still put out because we are in the middle of a pandemic. We would not have wanted to wait 10 years before we say, okay, this is now safe and effective and now try to stop the pandemic. The pandemic would have already passed through who it has to pass through. So we cannot be supplied with long-term safety evidence, and I think the General Secretary knows that. But the point that he made there about liability, I am in agreement with that point from the multiple unions, and I think that might be one of the points that the unions can hold on to and hammer home. The issue of liability. If there's any adverse effect to the vaccine, make it known that whichever employer insists and forces vaccination on their employees, you bear liability for it. And I think that is fair enough. If you're so sure, as I've said, over and over. If you're so sure it's safe and effective, then stand liability for it. If you insist that your workers must be vaccinated in order to start their job, then stand liability for it. That makes sense to me. And in between insisting that the employers stand liability and the first point he made about finding out the real way we calculate the death rate in Trinidad and Tobago, I think those 2 points, if all the unions stay to those 2 points, they would have a pretty strong standing to stand upon. The government or the employers hold liability and tell us exactly how the death rate is calculated. I like those 2 points from the NATOC president and, the NATOC general secretary. I keep making that mistake. And the reality is that I think because of the number of unions that have come out in opposition to this, if they are able to hold on to the points that really there are adverse side effects. After I took the job, I lost 3 inches in height. I highly doubt you got shorter after that. 5 years from now, they start to show up. And that, you see that? I've been thinking about that. Even with this pertinent point that the unions have of the employers holding liability for whatever happens with the vaccination. What if the possible adverse effects are far down the road and they're very difficult to link? If something happens 5 years down the road, it's not necessarily that easy to link it back to that specific thing. And especially if the case is that nearly the entire country would have been vaccinated. It's not like you could say, well, these people got the vaccine, these people didn't, and now we could see the difference, but everyone got the vaccine. So whatever happens may be happening to a large amount of people, and it would be very difficult to see the patterns in that case. So that in itself may be a bit difficult, but still, if the government and the employers do put themselves in a place to stand liability, there are tests that can be done to at least attempt to ascertain where some negative effect may have stemmed from. Very good point, Kivo TV. Is that the Kivo TV? Or, someone else? Asbestos was okay at a point, lead in paint was okay, benzene in fuel was okay. Good point, very good point. Let me have a drink of water too. Hey, J. Chris, thank you for being over there on the YouTube live also. And good day to Mantis Shadow, all of those locked on the YouTube live. Hello to you too. I appreciate it. How many of you are there right now? Let's see how many in this YouTube live right now. My YouTube live is packed full with 7 people watching, and I appreciate all 7 of you. Why is it easy to blame ailments on COVID yet overlook adverse effects of the job? Because COVID is a disease and the virus and the vaccine, the jab is supposed to be a medical help for the disease. So if there's something negative, you'd more likely be able to blame it on the disease than the jab. Makes sense to me in some extent. But I've been saying also that I've said this before. One of the reasons that the employers and the government in Trinidad can actually have some leeway to even make some mistakes and make some missteps and make some bad choices and some bad decisions on what they do during this COVID pandemic and on some of the measures they take during this COVID pandemic, some of the reason is because of the fortunate place Trinidad and Tobago finds itself. I remember, I believe it could have been the first or the second live, someone was speaking about how Trinidad and Tobago isn't serious about protesting, and Trinidad does not protest. And that is true to some extent. But part of the reason we don't get into some of the more heavier protests is because we are too rich. Trinidad has the benefit of affluence. When you have enough resources, it's not as tempting to go out in the streets. But I like to keep an eye out on our Caribbean neighbors who may not necessarily have the same resources we do and see how some of their reactions are going to some of the same things that are happening right here. For example, go look at Guadeloupe recently. Let's see. Protesters storm French island's capital over vaccine mandates. A group of demonstrators in the French territory of Guadeloupe have stormed the island's legislative chamber, holding an extended protest over a series of COVID-19 vaccine requirements imposed by their government. The protest kicked off on Thursday and extended into the next day, with activists seen hoisting banners and chanting slogans denouncing the pandemic measures after pushing their way into the legislature. Following the incursion on Thursday, which at some points got heated with activists destroying a Christmas tree in the building's lobby, Regional President Ari Chalos said he had agreed to meet with 10 protest leaders, though only after denouncing the invasion of the chamber as an act of intimidation and unworthy violence. Now, I found this interesting how he saw this. He said that by them storming the chamber, this was an act of intimidation. But here's it. By you insisting someone be vaccinated or they would lose their job, can't they also see that as an act of intimidation on their part? And if someone, that's why I was saying in one of the previous articles that you need consultation, you need conversation in these things. Because if you have someone in the position where they see what you're doing to them as being oppressive, what you're doing to them as being intimidatory, you're trying to intimidate them too, then how do you expect them to react? If I think you are trying to intimidate me into doing something that I don't see as beneficial to myself, then what position do you leave me in when I act? What do you expect me to do? Good night, Wendy. How the pastel going tonight? Are we finished with all the pastels? An overseas department of France, Guadeloupe, has required medical workers to be vaccinated or risk losing their paycheck, also imposing mask mandates and at both indoor and outdoor public spaces and creating a health pass system barring entry to unvaccinated at certain locations. Earlier this month, officials also briefly extended a curfew. In addition to blasting the COVID restrictions, now this I think is the most important thing in this entire article. This is the reason why you could see that level of protest in places like Guadeloupe. In addition to blasting the COVID restrictions, demonstrators also demanded improved access to clean drinking water. Listen, if I was struggling for clean drinking water and then you come to tell me I have to get vaccinated, I would want to protest too. Because obviously our priorities are misaligned. Because possibly, maybe, just probably, clean drinking water should be somewhere at a higher priority level than vaccination. They're also asking for increases to wages and pensions and called on officials to provide more employment opportunities for citizens. So that's the thing. Over in Guadeloupe, what they have would be a population where they have a higher rate of unemployment and a population where they're still asking for clean drinking water. And that's just the thing. And therein is the problem that if I were a Trinidad and Tobago politician, someone in the government, that's something that you would have to pay key attention to. If the measure you're trying to put into place is trying to be put into place over a community of people that already see themselves in a downtrodden, oppressed position, then the reaction you are going to get is going to be significant. If you do that to a population who sees themselves as already being comfortable enough, then very likely the reaction you get is going to be mild. So, almost all of these unions, the police union has already mentioned that a lot of their officers are working on salaries from 2015 or 2016, however far back. I always found that to be one of the strangest things in our government. We raise salaries 5-10 years in the past. Someone is discussing their salary for 2015 and 2013, wow, they're working on 2013 salaries. So we have 8 years passing in between, and my salary for the last 8 years still has to be negotiated. That is ridiculous. And then you're going to pay me in a lump sum for all the time. How does it function like this? Or I know nearly all public servants function like that. I know that, I'm aware of it, but I find it extremely ridiculous. This is dolly house behavior to me. I don't understand. If we're if we're if we're a serious company, if I hire someone and I tell you your salary is X and I'm going to raise it every year by X times 1.5, and 5 years have passed and I haven't done that, that is preposterous. And here's the problem with some of that: money loses value over time. If I get $100,000 now, what I could invest that $100,000 in now may be very likely more than I would be able to invest it in 10 years time. So if you take, and bear in mind, if someone says that they are supposed to give you an increase in your salary every year and they don't do that, technically speaking, according to your contract, according to how you look at it, you could be considering it, you could be seeing it as they're stealing money from you to some extent. So, if someone takes from you thousands of dollars every year, or hundreds of dollars every year, and you aren't allowed that, your investment opportunity for that extra money is also being lost. And how much you want to bet? If you owed the government that amount of money, they would have added interest on it. I find personally, if the government owes you money, they should be adding interest on it too. But all that is all that is being sidetracked. What I'm coming at here is when you're comparing Guadeloupe and what is going on in Guadeloupe and the amount of protests you're seeing there and the fervency of protests you're seeing there. In Guadeloupe, bear in mind, when they say they raided the capital, they ran into the capital. That's the proxy as if a group of people ran into the Red House in Trinidad and Tobago. You ran into the Red House and you're making demands. I am not advising that. I am not suggesting that. No, I'm not. But I'm saying that if the government continues and they attempt to push too stringent measures on people who see themselves as being unfortunate, who knows what the reactions are going to be. Now, I think there are some interesting points being made in the chat. Let me see if I can read through some of them. Someone is saying, I always get Morbi colored water, have to buy cases of bottled water. Now, here's the thing, Wendy Medium XL. The reality with that statement, it also says something about our country. I always get Morbi colored water, and that is unfortunate. That's a terrible thing. But on the other side of that comment is said, have to buy cases of bottled water to drink. And in Trinidad and Tobago, many people, probably even the majority of people, can afford that. Listen, can you imagine if you were getting that Morbi colored water and your salary was not enough to buy bottled water? Can you imagine what you may have been willing to do then? Yeah. Wendy Medium XL, we get a salary raise of $100 per year in these modern times. Someone is raising an interesting point. Their public service needs to meet expectations before a raise. Salary is earned, not an entitlement. I fully agree with you there, Mr. Urf. How do you pronounce that? Urfmeister. Urfmeister? However you pronounce that. I agree with you. I think our public service is not efficient. Our public service is very inefficient. Now, when you come into criticizing public servants and their work ethic, very often what you run up to is a lot of people saying, but I work very hard. I'm always doing my work. And maybe that might be true. And maybe what might be happening is you may be working for the 10 other lazy people who are not answering and saying that they're doing their work. Because Trinidadians are familiar with the public service. A lot of what happens in the public service is very inefficient. And if you're thinking about I think because of how Trinidad has been structured over time, understanding the history of Trinidad, where we came from during colonial times, and then we had our oil boom, and our oil boom was able to flood the country with money, and money was able to be spread out and shared out very easily. So there would have been people working for decades, even working in the public service and basically doing nothing and expecting a salary. They thought they would have been trained in their mind, this is how work works. Not all public servants are bad. There are, however, too much red tape. There is too much red tape, and that's true. And they would have thought this is what work is. What I need to do in order to get work is reach to my job, clock in my time, and when I clock out my time, then you must pay me. I think some of these people need to get into the private sector. Go put them in a farm. Go do some farming. And go see if you go into your farm and sit down all day and do no work and see if you'd make money. That's not how the system works. That's not how reality works. If you're working, hear this and note this very well. If you're working and you're being paid, or if you're employed, not working, if you're employed and you're being paid, but you aren't working, you aren't contributing to the economy, you are stealing from someone. All the resources in an economy is created by work. Someone is doing the labor to make these resources. If you are not doing labor and you are getting resources, you are stealing resources from someone. Now, the benefit Trinidad had for a very long time is that as a country, we could have produced a lot of resources for minimal labor in our oil and natural gas sector. So we would have had money flushed into the country without much labor having to be done to get that money. So that money could have just been splurged on the public servants, on the public sector. But many of you, I don't know how many of you in this chat, in this live would be this old, but to those who would be old enough to remember the early 90s, one of the reasons that helped to facilitate some of the discontent around the time of the coup in 1990 was the fact that the then Prime Minister had to cut some of the benefits to the public service. Why? Because after oil prices dropped and we had a drought time during that period, we couldn't sustain this inefficient public service that we have. All right, let me read some more points in the chat there. Not all public servants are bad. There's too much red tape. Question, how do we measure public sector efficiency? That's a very good question. And I'm not sure how we do it because many of the services provided by the public service are difficult to measure. And that's the thing. If you're working in most private sectors, in most private services, you can measure what this company does. Okay, if I go into KFC, if I go to a lawyer, if I go to nearly any private company and I want a service, I can measure how often, how quickly I can access the service, how convenient the service is to me, and I can measure up some efficiency and the value of the service because of that. But when you go into the public sector and you go into whatever the public sector controls and you have to get something done there, how do you really evaluate the proper pricing for that? Remember, most of the services we get from the public service are free to us. We don't have to pay for it. So how do we evaluate what is a fair price for that? That's a very good question, and I'm not sure if I'm sure of the answer. One of the ways that many people see for this is increasing privatization. That's one of the best ways to see how much something is worth. If it's put onto the open private market, you could see what people themselves would be willing to pay for it. But the problem is many public services cannot function on the private market. Most of the time, you don't have the proper tools, equipment to do your task. Who's at fault? Good night, unknown boy. Public sector should be measured by customer feedback and a formal charter of performance. Here's the problem. You see, there are so many problems that exist in the public service. There's also the reality that the public service has a bit of political football in it. So if you go by only customer feedback, you'd end up with the political problem, where you'd have political partisanship in how they do that public feedback. So I could understand the intent, but the nature of our country and how our country deals with partisan politics, it would be difficult to get around that. And as someone said there, whose fault it is if you're dealing with faulty and inefficient equipment? That's the fault of the higher ups. But that's something that goes through the entire public sector. This was one of my problems I had when I was speaking about the police service and their selection of a commissioner of police. That was one of my reasons. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Gary Griffith in himself, but I am kind of the opinion where I might prefer a commissioner outside of the police service, because the police service has some of that public sector functioning in it, where the higher ups are not there because they were masters of efficiency. They aren't there because sometimes they put in so much work. They are there because they lasted so long in the service, and by seniority, I've been here so many years, so it's my time to reach there. And then you have some of these same people higher up in the ranks, and then what is the attitude you would have trickling down the entire police service if that's who you have as the head? I could see it as being possibly beneficial to Trinidad and Tobago if you have an outside person as the commissioner, someone who is more tied to how effective they are at that job. You see, someone who is a police officer and becomes the police commissioner, all they need to do is maintain the status quo. Then when they reach retirement, they get their nice cushy pension and they go their way. That's just their job. But if you hire someone from the outside, where their job isn't as a police officer, their job is as a manager of the police service. So if they manage it badly, it reflects badly on their capabilities as a manager. So they have vested interest in looking better in managing the police service. The first problem in public sector efficiency is the budget process. Yup, that seniority thing needs to change to a merit-based system, but someone outside can also be political. All right. I didn't actually finish all my stories for today. There was I saw an interesting snippet of a story coming out today about some Coast Guards. The Coast Guards, was it the Coast Guards or was it the TTPS? I believe it was the TTPS that had cause to shut down a zest that was happening on a boat. People saw it fit to go on a little cruise out there. And strange enough, I believe none of them were arrested. None of them were held. They were released quickly after, pending investigations. Interestingly enough. All right, let me see some things in the chat. I think someone should have experience as an officer first to try and fill that seat. Oh, your friend was charged. Let me read that to you then. Police are investigating whether there were any public health regulation breaches after 100 persons were found on board a vessel in Chaguaramas. According to a TTPS release, the group was detained after the Ocean Pelican vessel was checked by officers on Sunday evening. The persons, including the boat's owner, were processed and released, with investigations by Acting Sergeant A. Adams continuing. So, according to their release, they say the people were released. So, but you said your friend was charged. So, interestingly enough, it was said the boat was a safe zone and all persons were vaccinated, but it was a ticket-sold event in a safe zone. The problem I've been hearing about that is that the safe zone permission they got was for a restaurant, I believe, around the Queen's Park Savannah, but they ended up on a boat in Chaguaramas. So where the safe zone was the kind of problem. The safe zone wasn't, the permission they got for a safe zone wasn't where they found them. I think that was the main problem that occurred there. The main problem, generally leadership in public sector needs to thrive and change and for efficiency. That's true. But how do you get the leadership in the public sector to change to a more efficient model when they don't need to? They really don't need to. They have no imperative, they have no incentive to change to a more efficient leadership style. The inefficiency benefits them. They're fine with that. Safe zone was on the high seas. That's tough. But I think I think if I was invited to a boat, if I bought a ticket to a safe zone event in a restaurant around the Queen's Park Savannah, and then at some point in time they tell me, well, actually, we're kind of changing the idea, and now we're going on a boat cruise, I would have said, return my money for my ticket, because that just sounds like a very, 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 very bad idea. It just sounded like it's not going to work. What about the safe zone fets they want to introduce? How would that work? Bluetooth wine. Gonna drop great thought-provoking convo. Keep up. Less politics, more progress. Agree, Mr. Urfmeister. Thoughts on the Barbados snap election? Good point you raised there, sir. The Barbados snap election. Motley calls early Barbados general election for January 2022. It's time to recalibrate as a people behind one government and one leader, says Prime Minister Mia Motley. So Barbadians will go to the polls on January 19th, 2022 to determine who will take the nation forward. Motley made that announcement while she was making a live speech that was streamed across various platforms. Now, I think that is a political move on Miss Motley's part. Miss Motley won the last Barbadian election, I believe, totally. They won every last seat. The election comes in May 3 years and 8 months into the Barbados Labour Party term after winning all 30 seats in May 2018. They won all the seats in the last election. But with the pandemic going on now, there's some friction building. You have the nurses in Barbados protesting. There are some people are expressing malcontent over what is going on there. But at the same time, Miss Motley right now has some of the most political weight in her career. She's coming off a year where her name has been sung high praises in the UN, in Trinidad. Many Trinidadians all of a sudden have realized, wait, there's a prime minister next door and we like what she's doing. So she has some political credence going forward. And I think this is part of the reason she would have called this election. So you have these malcontents stirring up a bit, but at the same time, you have some political credo. And you won the last election so comprehensively. If you call this election now, it may be able to pull in all these stragglers on the outside and let them know that, and let them come more closely into the whole 30+ winning of Miss Motley's government. And if she didn't call election now and she waited till the next year passed, it is very possible that what may have happened is the fueling of the discontent in the Barbadian society, the nurses protesting, etc., etc., and the pandemic and the fallout from the pandemic, whatever comes after that, may have just decreased her popularity. So it could make sense that you call the election now when you're at the highest in your popularity, so that you have you have the mandate now to go on for the next 5 years. I'm almost sure that Miss Motley is going to win that election. The Barbados opposition is barely even structured right now. Barbados didn't even really have an opposition. I think they had to kind of invent an opposition, because remember, they won all 30 seats. So the Barbados opposition isn't really there. They don't really have a structure. And then you don't only call an election. She didn't just call an election, she called a snap election. Meaning, I think their polls are going to be on January the 19th. That's basically 3 weeks away. If the opposition already is out of sorts, do you think they can organize themselves in 3 weeks to organize a national campaign in Barbados? I am wrong on the Barbados opposition. How am I wrong on the Barbados opposition? Miss Motley refuses to handle COVID with divisions. She wants teamwork. Bajans aren't happy with her, from what I've heard. They aren't happy with her. Because of the beach curfew, it's obvious that it will be crowded. How will the government not foresee this? The opposition is organized. Here's the thing. Even if they're semi-organized, they don't have much support. I've been following some Bajan news. I haven't seen any massive backing of the opposition. There has been some discontent in the society, and that happens because of the pandemic. And as I've said, That is the reason I think that she's calling this election, because there is some discontent. But I don't think that the discontent has reached a place where the opposition has been able to reach around to all the people who are discontent with what's going on and organize them into some kind of coalition. That's usually what happens in elections. What usually happens in elections is that you would have the opposition party. They would have to go around and meet the different people that are in disagreement with how the government is running things, and they would have to somehow meet and coalesce together in order to go forward in this election. But there isn't that right now in Barbados. I don't see that. I think personally, this is my forecast. And if I'm wrong, you'd be able to come back on January the 20th and tell me you were wrong. But I think that the Barbados government is going to sweep the election again. I think they aren't going to win as convincingly as they did in 2018, but I'm pretty sure they're going to win again. That's my view. We'll see how it turns out in the end. Someone asked my view on the crowding in Unboxing Day in South. Well, I don't know if any of you were there. I passed through Gulf City Mall on Boxing Day. The time I passed through, there were people there, but it wasn't that crowded when I passed. But people do what people do. That's the thing. Early on in this pandemic, I made a contemplation and I asked the question, if you have human nature moves in one direction, and then you make a policy that goes opposite to human nature, and human nature continues doing as human nature continues to do, would you expect human nature to change, or would it make more sense to change the policy? It's kind of an obvious question to me. The thing is, the problem with a lot of what the pandemic measures are aiming to do is they're aiming to fight human nature, natural movements of the things humans naturally do. And that's just the thing with viruses. An effective virus, what an effective virus does is, he says he wants to attach himself to the spread of something that is very common to humans. So humans are very social beings. We talk to each other. We are in close proximity to each other. So if a virus is able to spread by that very method, he has life forever. And for example, the HIV virus, HIV virus figured out that, humans do this one thing very regularly. And at the time the HIV virus popped up, humans were doing that one thing very regularly, and they were doing it very promiscuously also. We figured that was in the free times of the 60s and 70s. People were recognizing that what holds us to these morals? We can do as we please. And good question, Shiny Douglas, but I think you know the answer to that. And the HIV virus figured, okay, well, I would attach myself to this. And it did. And because the HIV virus attached it, HIV virus is redundant. The V is virus. But you understand what I mean? Because HIV attached itself to this very common human practice, it found itself spreading wildly. And although people were knowledgeable pretty early, well, not very early on, but relatively early on in the AIDS epidemic, we knew what AIDS spread with. We knew what caused AIDS to spread, what caused the HIV virus to spread. Yet still, HIV virus, the HIV still exists to this day. So that's my thoughts on the beach crowding on Boxing Day, the beach crowding the day after Boxing Day, high street crowding on on Christmas Eve, Port of Spain crowding on Christmas Eve, Chaguanas crowding on Christmas Eve. People are going to do what people are going to do. They've been doing this. Remember, some of these elderly people, some of these older people have brown down in them. For the last 50 years, every Christmas Eve, they like that hustle and bustle in the city center. Personally, I could do without that. But I know some people who say, they confess it, they like that crowd on Christmas Eve. They like the feeling. They like that feeling of rubbing shoulders and the hustle to get things done, and it really ignites their Christmas spirit. And okay, if that's what works for you, I understand. But the thing is, if that's their practice, if that's their common human nature practice, I don't think that government policy, I don't think that any amount of information or public knowledge campaigns is going to study that, is going to stop that. It's what they do. It's just what they do. You all have jokes, I see. You all have jokes. All right. I think I reached about an hour in my YouTube live. So I'm going to say goodbye to my YouTube viewers. How many people are still in on the YouTube? Are there any people still there? Hey, Mr. Jason Chatteram. Good night. I don't like my money to sleep out. I want my money, PM Rowley in 2015. That's very true. I remember him saying that. I've noticed that most of the bad service comes from the head offices in Port of Spain. Localized offices in smaller areas are usually much more efficient. This is just my observation and experience. Very good point from Mr. Jason Chattiram over on my YouTube. And I am in agreement with this. That's something I've noticed too. And it is reality. That's the problem with governance on a whole. Governance, the smaller governance is, the closer governance is to the people that it is governing, the better and more efficient it generally is. So, if you have a government office for your street, someone in your street votes for someone, and that one person is in charge of doing something on behalf of your street. You want to bet that that one person does it way more than if you voted for someone to do that from a head office in Port of Spain, because decentralization works, as someone in the chat says. That is very true. And that observation I've noticed also. So if you go down to smaller offices in smaller areas across the country and you ask for things done there, very often you get it much faster than some of those main head offices. And for so long, you've heard government after government talk about decentralizing and getting things to spread out across the country and making it closer for people to get access to these things, but nobody seems to be interested in it. And I have a suspicion sometimes that they wouldn't want to decentralize some things, because if you decentralize some things, then that Alexandra building that is being paid many millions for to a certain someone, if you know who that certain someone is, that Alexandra building cannot be paid for if you decentralize all these services. You want things centralized into these massive buildings that you then pay rent for. Strange. But very good point to Mr. Jason Chattiram. I'm glad I looked over on YouTube before I closed it off. So I'm going to say goodbye to my YouTube live now. Don't worry, we're going to be chatting some more here on TikTok.